Hi, so I'm Amalia Miller. I'm at the University of Virginia, and it is my pleasure to be here to host our session this week as part of this We Are seminar series. And we'll just jump right in. To this week, we have Michaela Pagel. I should have asked you.
That's good.
Okay, from Columbia, and she's coming to us from a deep finance background, looking at lots of different issues within finance. And the paper she's going to present today is about gender quotas and support for women in board elections. And she's told me that this is her first foray into gender, so hopefully we'll give lots of constructive and supportive feedback and encourage her to stay working on this important topic. So just a brief mention of the ground rules. So I think in general, these seminars are 40 minutes presentation and then 20 minutes Q&A. Michaela has said that she is open to questions, not just clarifying, but substantive questions all the way through. So I'm going to encourage everyone to ask questions. And if it gets a little out of control, Michaela, you can tell us to pull back, and we will kind of defer some to the end if we're kind of interrupting your message. So let's get started. Thank you to everyone for joining. And Michaela, got it.
Perfect. Well, thank you so much for inviting me to present this paper. And yes, I've been for a long time an enthusiastic consumer of the gender literature, and this is my first contribution to it. And it's a paper that is still sort of fairly new, although I guess at this point, like, you know, we have worked on it for quite a bit, so it matured a bit, but I still view it as one of my more recent papers. The title is Gender Quotas and Support for Women in Board Elections, and this is joint work with Marina Gerzberg and Johanna Mallerström. So the setting that we here look at is corporate boards. And if you have a corporation that is publicly traded, so the stock of the corporation is traded on stock markets, public stock markets, then you have to have a board of shareholders that represent the interest of the shareholders. So this is the corporate board. And now typically corporate boards in the US of, say, you know, the S&P 500 companies are sort of like 6 or 7 or 8 white men. And in California in 2018, somewhat surprisingly, there was a gender board quota law enacted. And the announcement was on September 30, 2018. And the gender board quota is that by the end of 2019, all boards of corporations that are headquartered in California need to have at least one woman. And by the end of 2021, all boards of corporations headquartered in California have to have 2 women for board sizes that are up to 5 people, and then 3 or more women for board sizes that are 6 or more people. And as said, it applies to all public firms headquartered in California. And then if the firms do not comply, they have to file a SEC filing for why they are not complying, and then they might be fined with $100,000 for the first violation and $300,000 per seat not filled. And so the gender board quota had the desired effect in substantially increasing women representation on corporate boards. So you can see here that since 2016, the share of women was like in 2016, only 12% of the board members, and it increased to almost 25% by 2020. And you can see the effects of the board quota even more distinctly in this graph, which is restricting on new board members or new nominees for the board. So you can see here that before the board quota, and most of the board elections happen in the proxy season, like April to June every year. So that's why you see like these spikes here. So you can see before the quota, it was mostly new men and very few new women. And then after the quota, you can see here, it's almost half of the new board members or new nominees are women after the quota. So the quota has the extended effect. Yes.
Sorry, Michaela, can I ask a clarifying question?
Yes.
You'll probably tell us later, but I'm wondering if who makes these nominations, if it's the board. So there's someone making the nominations and then someone else deciding amongst the nominees who gets elected. I'm assuming the board does the electing, but who nominates?
Yes. I'm going to talk a little bit more about this. I have a slide on this, but just to summarize, so what's happening is that the existing board is proposing new nominees, and then the new nominees are elected in the shareholder meetings that typically happen in like April, May, June every year. And then the shareholder can vote for or against each nominee. However, what's happening in practice is that all the nominees end up serving at least 1 year. So if a nominee, say, doesn't get a whole lot of votes, it has been shown that this affects sort of the length of time that he or she is going to serve. But immediately, it's sort of the board deciding, if you will, who's going to serve in the next year and how the board composition looks. And then shareholders sort of approve it or not. So the
can I interrupt also? It's just a question about the time period, because I know it looks like you stop in 2020, and I was wondering if part of that is because I know I've read stories about this quota being challenged in the courts and now it's on hold. Can you just give us the context? So is when did that happen, or you know what I'm talking about, right?
Yes. So the quota got repealed recently. I think it happened so we deliberately stop our sample period before the repeal. So the repeal happened, I think, in 2022. So it's a little bit post our sample period, and we have sort of a window of 2 years pre versus 2 years post the gender quota. And I'm going to talk a little bit about the repeal because we did some research on this as well to look at, the announcement returns, etc. And so the law got repealed because the plaintiff was saying that there doesn't exist sort of convincing evidence in the academic literature as to, whether board quotas are a good or a bad thing. So in some way, we sort of think that our paper is in that sense extremely timely and policy relevant because there are these laws that are debated, and typically when laws get repealed, that don't mean that they are off the table, but instead that they will be replaced with a amended sort of version. So in that sense, we think that our paper is like very important right now because we hope that we contribute something to the existing evidence that seem to be insufficient for the law to either keep existing or being sort of not enacted in the first place. So so in that sense, exactly, got repealed. That doesn't mean it's off the table. It's probably going to be reinstated in some way. But that's why our paper, I think, is very important right now. Perfect. So far the gender board quota had the intended effect of really increasing female board representation. And now our question is, or the question that we are trying to answer in this paper, is whether or not shareholders dislike when the government is mandating female board members. And the reason that we are looking at this question is because there is some existing literature that is a little bit conflicting. And what we are trying to do here is sort of bring new data to the table that reconciles some of the conflicting existing research. So what is out there already is that there are a few papers that have shown for female board quotas that stock prices or shareholders generally react negatively to them. So there's a Hung et al. Paper and Green et al. Paper and another one that I saw recently that is saying that stock prices reacted negatively to the quota. And for the California quota, it is because it came so surprising. That is why it's sort of well suited for an event study. And before that, there was a Norwegian gender quota, for example, and there were some papers that sort of showed there's a negative stock price reaction and value destruction because of it, and then some other papers that were sort of like not showing that. But for the Norwegian quotas was a little bit tricky, like to exactly figure out what is the event date, for example. So these sorts of things in the California context were better because it was unclear which stance the governor would take in approving or not approving the law, or enacting, not enacting the law, and it came somewhat surprising. So there are these papers that show that stock prices reacted negatively to the quota. And, you know, the basic premise behind the negative stock price reaction is simply like, well, if there are not enough qualified women board members out there, then adding sort of less qualified board members might destroy value. So that's the idea here. Now, however, there are also then some other papers that sort of look at the qualifications of the female board members. For example, whether they're independent, you know, whether they have served on a lot of boards so far of sort of similarly large companies, et cetera, et cetera. And those papers were painting a little bit of an incomplete picture, in the sense that it wasn't documented, or they couldn't document that the new women are worse in sort of all dimensions. Now, it's very tricky, however, because you have all these different qualifications, right? And it's very difficult to sort of say like, oh, one board member is less qualified than another. So that is a little bit the tricky, because you don't really know what sort of qualifications shareholders care about. So there are these like two literatures, one showing like, oh, stock prices reacted negatively, so it seems the quota is a bad thing. And then, however, the papers that look at the qualifications of the board members that sort of couldn't document that these women are, you know, objectively worse, although it's a little bit tricky because you don't really know what qualifications shareholders value, of course. So now where we're going to go is we're going to bring some new data to the table, which is shareholder votes. So we have sort of a summary measure of how well supported a man or new woman is on the board. And then we are sort of thinking about all the different ways that a firm can react to the quota. So, and then we sort of group firms into 4 mutually exclusive groups of the different actions they can take. So one of the actions that a firm can take is sort of do nothing, right? So do not add a woman for now, sort of wait to see what happens. And this is what some firms did. Then what they could do is they could add a woman and expand the board size. And this is also what like around 25% of firms do, is that they add a woman and then they have a larger board. And it's a little bit tricky though, because, well, first of all, if you ever have written a paper with a lot of co-authors, you know that, you know, adding people is not always, you know, process enhancing. And then also it is sometimes a bit tricky in this context, because if you expand the board, there are also more women required, possibly, right? Because if you have 5 board members, you need 1 woman, but if you have 6, you need 2 women. But that is something that firms can do. They can expand the board. Then another thing that firms can do is that they can add a woman, and then they can basically they can replace a man, right? They add a woman and have a man exit, and they can choose who should exit, right? And they can, for example, choose a director who is not very well supported by shareholders, who doesn't have like very, you know, good, the type of qualifications that shareholders value. And then the 4th thing that they can do, so they can pick the least supported director, right? Add a woman and have the least supported director depart. Or firms can add women, but then turn over a more highly supported director. So, and, you know, now you may actually have a situation in which the board responds in a way that might be value destroying by adding a woman, but not turning over the least supported male directors. So, and basically in this paper, we're going to show that the negative stock price reaction is exactly driven by the 25% or so of firms that do not turn over their least supported directors when they add a woman.
Michaela, can I ask a question?
Mhm.
I was thinking from the start, because the quota is not a percentage, but an absolute number of women, that the impacts on performance, on shareholders, on most interesting outcomes will depend on the baseline size of the directorship. So I'm going to look at that. Do you find that? Because of course, adding one woman, and say even if it's replacing that person with a man in a board that had a baseline size of 100 people, it's not going to matter as much as if the baseline size was 5.
Yeah, this is a good point. So we always control for board size in our regression, but we haven't sort of looked, like we haven't broken down the sample specifically by boards where the share of women makes a big versus small percentage. But I agree with you that this is sort of like a treatment intensity. So I like the idea of looking a little bit more closely into this, for sure. It's a very good point.
Sorry, can I ask another question?
Mhm.
You seem to assimilate the popularity, meaning the support among shareholders of the director, to the director's contribution to the value of the firm. That doesn't seem immediate to me. I could imagine situations in which there are a lot of in-board fights that lead to all sorts of different alignments between popularity and value.
Yeah, so I totally agree with you. So, however, I think for the purpose of our paper, you don't necessarily have to equate popularity or like shareholder support with value. So I think it's fine to just equate shareholder support with just like some summary measure of perceived, like, so our main conclusion from looking at the shareholder support measure is that shareholders do not disapprove of the new female nominees. And then we are sort of asking like, well, why, how come that share prices react negatively if shareholders approve of the new female nominees? So in some way, you know, and then what we then sort of like make responsible for the value destruction is what we label as like suboptimal replacement. But I totally agree with your what you say, which is that it is a little bit of you know, a leap of faith to make to equate shareholder votes with quality. So, but I think we are not even doing that, so to say, to tell our story. But let me talk a little bit, get there and talk. I'm going to talk about the shareholder votes and what exactly we do in a second.
Can I just ask one question about the picture you had just before you leave the slide? Just as I'm looking at this, it seems that it doesn't include the situation where, you know, a board member is leaving sort of exogenously, not because they're being kicked off. And so is that kind of implicit in like one of the other categories, or is it that you can't distinguish empirically between like retirements or death or other things? You know what I mean? Not every man that leaves is being fired. It could be a very good guy is no longer available, and that is bad, and not because there's a woman replacing him, right?
Yes. So this is a very good point. So we, for example, when we group the firms into the different categories, we exclude departures of directors because of those reasons that are not under the board control, like retirement or death, for example. So we can actually, in our data, we know because we know the name of each director, so we know exactly what happens to them. So we are not going to say, like, if say a director dies and it's a more popular one, then the firm wouldn't fall into the category of responses, like add woman and turn over the more popular director. That said, sometimes it's a little bit, you know, this is possibly a little bit incomplete. So we have been thinking a little bit about the possible measurement error that we obtain in basically our first stage regressions where we sort of group the directors into these different buckets, because it, like, even though we exclude things like death and retirement, it might still be a situation where a more popular director leaves, right? And it has actually nothing to do with sort of like, you know, the board not doing an optimal turnover, but he or she leaves for other reasons. So that is possible. So we account for that in our first stage analysis by basically, you know, accounting for the standard error that the classification might be, you know, might be subject to measurement error. Perfect. So let me just summarize. So we're going to use shareholder votes to first sort of make the point that shareholders seem to approve of the new women that are added to boards. So there doesn't, like, you know, there are the papers that look at qualifications. So we are sort of like providing additional evidence for their conclusion, which is that it doesn't seem to be the case that the new women are worse in some way than the existing man. So, and then we are sort of like left with, well, okay, well, if the women are well supported, then how come that that stock prices react negatively? So, and then we sort of like wonder, well, I can add qualified women, but there's another mistake I can make in the board restructuring process, and that is basically like replace the wrong man. So, and that would then result in a negative stock price reaction. And this is what we show. We basically show that for the one bucket of firms that do the suboptimal replacement, those are the firms that have a statistically significantly different and negative share price reaction that we don't see for any of the other three groups. Okay, so let me talk a little bit, this already came up, shareholder votes as our measure of approval of the new woman or you know, the existing man, and our measure of sort of like the classifying whether a turnover is done right from the perspective of the shareholders, in the sense that the less supported directors leave and the more supported directors like stay. And the shareholder votes we sort of view as a measure of, you know, a summary measure of the individual director quality and fit. And now there are two things that are important to keep in mind here when looking at shareholder votes. First, I already mentioned this, when a shareholder votes against the nominee, then the shareholder doesn't have to worry that the nominee doesn't end up serving. So in that sense, we believe that there's no reason to vote for women nominees just in order to comply with the quota, because the woman nominee will serve no matter what, pretty much. And I think it happens like maybe twice for two nominees in our entire sample of like 20,000 nominees that they were nominees but didn't end up being members of the board. So shareholders can sort of, you know, express their discontent without having to worry that the firm is not going to meet the quota. And however, at the same time, the shareholder votes are not completely meaningless, because that wouldn't be good for us either. So there are a bunch of papers in the corporate governance literature that show that low shareholder support predicts, you know, less time that the nominee serves on the board, predicts higher turnover. So it is an important tool for shareholders to sort of express their content or discontent with the nominees. So they are not meaningless. At the same time, we don't really have to worry that shareholders vote for women just because they want the firms to comply with the quota. So what do we have here? So we have from the SEC filings, firms have to provide information every year about who they put up for, who the board puts up for election, and then what are the characteristics of the shareholders. So here we focus on the firms headquartered in California, because those are the firms to which the new law applies. We have around 600 firms, 3,000 election, and around 15,000 nominees total of these firms. And then we collect data January 2016 to end of 2020. So we sort of have like a relatively short window around the quota. And in fact, when we sort of look at the replacement, we focus on the year of 2019, right, which is the first year that firms can make or firms have to make the adjustments. And our sort of variable of interest is just the support, the shareholder support. It's a number of 4 votes relative to the number of all other votes, basically. And the support is really high. So the average is 94%. So that's why I said like all nominees almost always serve, because the average support is really high. But it's not the case that there's no variation in it. So the standard deviation is around 10%. So that means that, some nominees get 85% and some nominees get 100%. And generally, if nominees get less than 90% support, that's sort of considered low support. And that affects their turnover. That actually increases their turnover by around 25%, as have these other papers shown that I just mentioned. So
Question.
Go ahead, Sonia.
I just wondered if you can look at turnout or voting turnout as an outcome. So
so we have election fixed defects in our analysis. So all of the sort of election like all of the election characteristics should be captured by that, but we could also just generally look at whether
substantive interest. I wonder, I have a feeling that maybe you'd see an increase in turnout after the quota. And I guess that, do you have shareholder characteristics? So for example, do you know if the shareholders are men or women?
So we don't know that. We can differentiate between institutional shareholders versus not. So we do some robustness checks to sort of see whether our results are driven by institutional shares, like Vanguard, BlackRock. We don't find evidence for that. So it seems like through the board. But yeah, we wouldn't know, like who exactly is casting the vote. But yeah, so any if the turnout changes, say before versus after the quota, it should be picked up by our election fixed defects, not so to say our support measures.
Can I step in again? I mean,
yes.
Just seconding the previous question. It is natural to think of the election when it's presented as in this slide as having all these tiny shareholders who vote individually and will not affect the outcome, etc., which I imagine is not really what is happening in many of these corporations where probably there are institutional shareholders or big shareholders. So maybe having some sense of, what's the distribution of voting power in these corporations would complement would help us think through the question.
Yeah, no, I totally agree with it. So yeah, so we did one sample split. I don't have that in the slide by institutional versus not. But I totally agree with you that maybe there's a little bit more that we can do.
And this is related to the same theme about these voters, as my sense is that a lot of the individuals would just give a proxy access or something, and so they're just kind of letting the board have their vote. Are you able to see whether?
Yeah, only again, only to the extent that institution, when institutions vote for the people that don't vote, right? So we can split by institutional, the shareholders of institutions versus not, if the shareholders are institutions versus not, but I don't think we can, I have to see whether there's something else we can do. But this is so far the one thing we did. And there we found that, if you just split the sample by firms that are majority institution held versus not, that it seems the same.
Okay, and then this is, I don't know the facts of this, but if there's a large institutional shareholder, I mean, do some of these companies have a world where shareholders themselves can either make nominees, or is always from top down from the board?
Oh, yes, it's always the board that is deciding who are the nominees. And then the shareholders are informed about who the nominees are. And most elections are uncontested in the sense that there are exactly as many nominees as there are board seats. And as said, it only happened like twice or so in our entire sample that we have a nominee that doesn't end up serving. So in some firms, when there's like a majority versus plurality voting rule, it means that sometimes you only need one positive vote and then you will serve. So that's why I said, like, shareholders don't really have to worry that the woman or man is not going to serve. They will always serve. But if you have low shareholder support, it does affect your turnover in the sense that you're going to serve less time because the shareholders express their discontent.
And then just one other question about the timing. So the board members are not voted on every year, right? They serve for a term that spans more than a year. And so when the term, or I guess that varies by company for how long it is. Like, are you looking at their historical support from the last election and maybe something changed to make them less popular, or?
Yes, so it varies by election. So there are classified boards versus non-classified boards. And in classified boards, everybody is voted on every year. So, and, we sort of, for all our analysis, we provide the same table for restricting only to classified boards. And also in our turnover analysis, we only bucket a director into the, so if there's the least supported director says not up for election in the election after the quota, then we wouldn't bucket that firm into least supported, not replaced. So this is a least supported who's also up for election. But as said, so around half, a little bit more of the firms are classified boards anyway. And in classified boards, everybody's up for election every year. Perfect. So let me show you just the raw data of support. And here, basically, what you will see in the raw data is sort of then just confirmed in our multivariate analysis with election fixed effects. So generally, what you can see is that before the quota, the new woman always had the largest support of all the groups. So we have 4 groups here: new woman, new man, incumbent woman, and incumbent man. And the new women always have the largest support, which is sort of consistent with an observation that has been made in many, many data sets, which is that, that the women in certain positions tend to be even more qualified than the man because there's a glass ceiling. So this is also what we see here. And then we see that after the quota, it seems like the support for the new woman is decreasing, but it's sort of staying marginally above the support for new men. So, and that's what we're going to document. We're going to show that the support for new women is decreasing, which is not so surprising given that there's probably some sense in which the firm has to dig deeper in order to find like good women, or might even, decrease the quality a little bit of the woman, which is why the quota was there in the first place. But the support for new women stays above the support for new men. And then you can sort of see that the support for incumbent women is hovering around, doesn't change too much. And then the support for the incumbent man seems to decrease substantially. And this is also what is ultimately related to our final result, which is that the value destructions is coming from a new woman being added, but then the incumbent man, it seems like a bunch of firms are replacing directors that are more highly supported rather than replacing directors that are not well supported. Also, one thing I want to point out, if shareholders would just sort of vote for women because of the quota, we would expect the support for incumbent women to go up, and we don't see that. So we feel that is also somewhat reassuring that the votes seem to be a sort of reasonable measure of director support for the nominee rather than driven by other things. So now we're going to basically show the same findings in a regression with election fixed effects. And in that regression, the one comparison that we are most interested in is comparing the new woman versus new man pre and post quota, and specifically the new woman versus new man post quota, because we want to understand whether the negative share price reaction is driven by shareholders not approving the new woman. So this is what we have here in our main table. So we can see here that when we have all nominees in that are up for election, so this is why we have the observation of 14,000 rather than 17,000, because there are some directors that are not up for election, right? So of the new firms that are all the directors that are up for election, what we can see here is that one observation that of the incumbent nominees past the election, women are more supportive. This is this decrease in support for the male nominees. And then we have the new nominees. Before the election, women are more highly supported than men. And then this sort of decreases after the quota. So before the quota, new women are more supported than new men. And after the quota, new women are marginally but insignificantly more supported. So if we have an interaction of like new woman post, then that interaction coefficient is negative. So new women do support after the quota. So and then we sort of restricted to new nominees only, right? And here we can see that while new women before the quota were more supported, that support decreases, but it's still marginally significantly new women are more highly supported than new men. So and this is our main conclusion from this analysis, that when we look at the support of new women versus new man, it doesn't seem to be the case that shareholders do not approve of the new woman. And we can here again see this other observation that it seems like incumbent women are more supported after the election. And as we saw in the graph before, this is because the incumbent man lose a lot of support. And as we say, this is sort of like a result of the firm not doing the replacement right. It seems like they are sort of a significant subset of firms are sort of keeping the less well-supported man and then add a woman. And that doesn't seem to be to fly well with the shareholders.
But Michaela, can you illuminate why firms would do that? Like, why would, if they are losing a man, why would they lose? Why would they do it that way? Just what you said, the worst performer rather than the better performer.
So so this is a good point. So we sort of view it as like basically an entrenched board situation. And we don't even think it's the board per se, but it could also just be the individual male shareholders that successfully hold on to their position, right? And, they might be incentivized to hold on to their position because after the quota, which made women like more valuable, if you will, their outside options deteriorated, for example. And that is sort of the story we have in the back of our minds, that there's entrenchment in the board in the sense that weak directors are able to hold on to their power.
So just in terms of empirically, that story, it seems, so you're looking at the vote share in the current election, but for the incumbents, you also see what their votes were previously. Mm-hmm. So you could do the incumbent analysis looking at how popular they were in the previous election and see if that, because the selection story is about the previous election in some sense. And so you should see the same pattern, right? Because the other thing that could be happening is that the men are actually becoming less popular, and that's why they're not getting as high of, not because of a selection story, but because of a voter, you know, a shareholder preference story.
No, this is exactly what we do.
Like
So
that they don't
yeah.
like these men and there's something they're not happy about with the firm, and that would also be associated with a bad, potentially, stock market reaction, that now everyone knows about this conflict going on, right, within the firm, where people are not happy about the directors.
Yeah, no, this is exactly what we are doing. So when we classify the directors as least supported, we use the results from the last election before the quota. So, and then we are basically asking, is this director replaced the least supported directors, least or second least supported directors? We can do it with both the.
But not on this slide. You're saying later when you do the split. I'm just saying on this slide,
Yeah.
you could do this using the previous vote for the incumbents, not for the new.
Yes. Oh, I'm not sure I fully understood this. Wait, so we have like either we can pool all directors, we can have only new nominees or only incumbents.
Column 3, where you did the incumbents.
Yeah.
So right now you're doing the vote share in their new election, right?
Yeah, so no, this is just restricting the sample to only incumbent nominees, but because
and the outcome variable is the vote, right?
Yes, the support.
Right. So I'm just saying you could do that using the support in the prior election instead of in the current election.
Oh, so this is actually support in all elections, before and after. And then, you know, we have like, say, we restrict to the incumbent nominees. So we have like 2 categories.
Oh, right, no, I get that. I'm just saying for each observation, each observation is a particular, and I don't want to, we could talk about this offline. I'm just saying each election, here you're using the outcome as this person's support in this election, and you could just use their support in the prior election. But maybe that's not a good idea. We could talk more later.
Yeah. So I haven't fully, we'll talk later. I think we do something what you have in mind, but not in this analysis, but in the what I'm going to show you now. So far it seems like that women are not less well supported. The new women are not less well supported than new men. That's sort of what we wanted to establish here and what we use the shareholder votes for. And then the question is like, okay, well, how come that the stock market reacted negatively then? So the first thing we did here is we replicated the results in the previous literature, just to make sure, you know, we find the same thing. And that's what we do. So the firms that violate the quota announcement have a negative announcement return around the quota announcement time. And then especially when they sort of need more directors by the end of 2021. So, you know, relative to 2021, you might be short 1, 2, or 3 directors. And then this is violation 19, is that at the time of the quota announcement, you violate the 2019 requirement. So, and we can see that the current valuation, as well as being short directors, tends to make the announcement return worse. And that's also what previous papers found. So now the question is like, so we find that new women have a lot of support, but there's this like decrease in support for incumbent men. So our story is that the firms do not do the replacement right, in the sense that they add new women that are well supported, but they do not have the least supported men depart, and that's what firms don't like, and that results in the value destruction. So what we do now is we classify firms into these like 4 different buckets, right? Like, you know, one sort of group of firms where I think it's just there's uncertainty. So ultimately they end up not doing anything. And this is like around 20% of the firms. Then some firms that expand the boards, some firms that replace, but do the replacement right, in the sense that, you know, they turn over the least or second least supported director. And then the firms that add women, but do not turn over either the least or second least supported director, even though that person is up for election. And we also take into account, like, you know, departures of directors due to death or retirement, and do not classify those as, you know, turn over more popular director if they happen. So now we have sort of 2 models in mind. So for our story to work, we have to assume that in 2018, September 2018, at the quota announcement, shareholders are able to predict which firms are going to do the replacement right in the next year, in the sense that they will turn over the more popular directors, the least popular directors, or do it wrong in the sense that they won't turn over the least popular directors. So, and we have sort of two ways we can show this. One is sort of assuming that shareholders have perfect foresight, in the sense they know exactly which firms will do what. And then this seems like a little bit unrealistic. We have basically a prediction model, right, of how a firm will respond. And the prediction model is using only variables that are known to shareholders at the time of the quota announcement. And they basically include common measures of board entrenchment or corporate governance quality. So for example, you know, whether a board is classified, that is probably a higher corporate governance quality board because shareholders have more say. Or, you know, plurality voting versus majority voting, that is, does a shareholder only need one vote? So that probably protects weak directors. Or there are also other corporate governance measures, for example, co-opted board, which is a measure of board entrenchment in the sense that it sort of like measures how many board members were hired after the CEO. And, you know, this is sort of the idea that the CEO is initially going to hire more friends, and then ultimately, as the firm matures, it's sort of going to get a representation that is more in the shareholders' interest. So, and we basically then going to show that shareholders are able to predict which firms are going to do the replacement wrong. And this is exactly the firms that have the negative the negative stock price announcement returns. So first, let me show you this. So here we regress then the announcement returns on the 4 things that the firms can do, right? They might expand the board, right? Add a woman. And you can see here that this does not decrease the announcement return. They may add a woman and have the least supported directors turned over, second or least supported ones. And you can again see, like, you know, this is there's no negative announcement return for these firms. Then we have the bucket of firms that add a woman and do not turn over the least supported directors. And here we can see significantly negative announcement returns. And then they have a group of firms for which we think there's uncertainty that ultimately don't do anything. They don't end up paying a fine either, but they file a report at some point as required to explain why they don't have a woman yet. So we think these might be small firms. It's a little bit unclear what they are doing. So here we can see that the negative stock price reaction is concentrated in the firms that seem to not do the replacement right. And now we have this like predictive model, right? So here we do not use the actual behavior of the firm, like add woman and do not turn over the least supported directors, but instead we use our predictive model to predict how likely a firm is to be in the bucket of add woman and least supported not turn over, and then we use that prediction instead of the actual behavior. So, and here we can see that the coefficient is even larger and negative. So shareholders are able to predict with measures known at the time of the quota announcement which firms are not going to do the replacement right. And so we can see here co-opted board is this like, it's in the corporate governance literature, it's sort of a measure of board entrenchment. Plurality voting, that's like the director just needs one vote to be elected, as opposed to at least 50% of the votes. ISS opposition. So ISS is a institutional shareholder service. So they give a voting recommendation. And this is also something that we can control for in our previous analysis. But we use that basically as a signal that a director is especially bad. So that is, you know, what we sort of like view as an indication that this is a particular entrenched board where there's a director serving, even though the ISS issued a recommendation against him. And then like other corporate governance board controls, So this includes like general sort of corporate control, such as firm size, for example. So I'm getting a little bit low on time, and that's why, but I only have like a bunch of robustness checks that I'm going to show you, and then I'm going to conclude, and then maybe we have a few more minutes for questions. So let me just tell you all the robustness checks we did very briefly. So there's one, I wanted to show this, but then I thought initially the presentation is only 40 minutes. But this is another piece of evidence that I really like. So one other thing we did is we sort of looked at like, if a firm has a large predicted probability of not doing the replacement right, but then is actually replacing the least supported directors, we do see a positive announcement return to that replacement. So that was sort of like an additional piece of evidence that I thought is a nice check, like a nice sanity check for our story. We also look at long-term effects, like things like Tobin's Q, for example, and we do find a little bit of evidence for that the board entrenchment seems to be also correlated with like long-term negative effects on firm value. We can control for industry fixed effects, market size, market cap, like, you know, all of those sort of common controls in the corporate literature. Somebody asked also, so somebody asked about death and retirements. And then also what we were, or what some people pointed out is that sometimes certain committee chairs have a lot of power, like the audit committee or the compensation committee chair. So we wanted to make sure that our results are not driven by departures of committee chairs, but sort of like more regular directors rather than like special cases. And then all of our analysis holds in the non-classified boards. So where everyone is up for election every year. Then we had this idea that, well, maybe shareholders only vote for women because of the quota. So, but we do not find evidence that the support for the incumbent woman is increased, and we also don't find evidence that the new women have increased support relative to their characteristics using data from before the quota. So it seems like they have like equally good qualifications relative to their support. We also control for ISS recommendations, so that doesn't change the results. We sort of split the sample in various ways, like by institutional stock ownership, etc., or like institutions which we thought have a built-in preference for women. So this seems like through the board sort of situation. And then we also looked at firms that are outside of California, and there we find similar patterns, but less extreme, which is sort of what we would expect. And we do not find this decline for incumbent men, which, right, we think is a result, like an unintended consequence, if you will, of the quota. So I'm gonna stop right here because I'm out of time, but thank you so much for all your questions, and I'm happy to hear any more questions and comments you might have.